Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Shares in the outsourcing company Capita have fallen by more than 40% after it warned that profits for the coming year will be much lower than previously forecast. It comes just over 2 weeks after the collapse of Carillion, another major outsourcing company. Well, our business editor Simon Jack is here. So, Simon, the obvious question to ask is, are we looking at another Carillion here?
There are some similarities, but there are some really important differences. Similarities: big outsourcing company, lots of public service contracts. It's also issued a massive profit warning today, saying profits will be materially lower. So everyone, obviously, after Carillion, super nervous, and you saw the shares react today. They also got nervous in the markets because they did two things. They said they were going to cancel their dividend to try and preserve cash, and they were going to try and raise £700 million in new equity, money essentially that doesn't have to be paid back. But some people will say this company is doing precisely what Carillion should have done a year or 2 years ago, and sort of trying to bolster its finances and take a restructuring approach. And, you know, both of those things would have made the share price fall anyway. They're doing it while it's still got £1 billion in the bank. So people are saying this is not another Carillion. The government certainly doesn't think it is. Having said that, given the flack the government got for giving contracts to Carillion after it issued a massive profit warning, will it be straightforward for Capita to get new public service contracts? I think that's pretty unclear at the moment.
Thank you.
Now, another big government contractor admitted today it's struggling with financial problems. Shares in Capita, which runs a number of public sector contracts, plunged to a 15-year low after it issued a profits warning and launched a major rescue plan. Well, our business editor Joel Hills is here, and the question has to be asked, isn't it? Is this another Carillion?
Well, look, we've seen a profits warning out of the blue, a sudden slump in the share price at another big outsourcer. But there are important differences between Carillion and Capita, not least the fact that Capita is still with us and it has a fighting chance of survival. Now, the British government is the biggest customer for both companies, but also interesting difference in the services, the public sector services, important ones that they provide, Mary. Carillion staff tended to build things, would serve school meals and clean prisons. If you look over at Capita, though, very different. A lot of software, IT. Capita runs the IT system for the NHS. It manages patient records. It also does the same for Department of Work and Pensions, including running the Job Seekers Allowance helpline. Capita also runs the electronic ankle tagging system for the Ministry of Defence. Now, the Ministry of Justice, I beg your pardon. Now, the company has, this year alone, £238 million of government contracts that are set to expire. If it holds on to those, then it's a step in the right direction. It employs 50,000 people in the UK, though, Mary, and the union is saying there will be job losses.
Well, what's important is that the company gets around the table with recognised unions and consults with us on how we manage this. There are thousands of workers tonight who will be worried about what this means for their families and their livelihoods, and they deserve to be treated with respect.
The new chief executive, Mary's got a plan to turn this business around. He joined in December. It involves tapping shareholders for £700 million to repay debt. He suspended the dividend. He's taking some really tough decisions, but he feels this company has a fighting chance of surviving.
OK, so watch this space in other words, Joel. Thank you very much indeed. Now, it supplies a raft of services for the public sector, has posted a profit warning, and today saw its share price fall by almost 50%. But the chief executive told Channel 4 News the decisive action he'd taken today meant what happened to Carillion won't happen to them. But unions have called on the government to do an urgent risk assessment, saying the country cannot afford another Carillion. Our business editor Siobhan Kennedy reports.
Another day, another company with big government contracts suffers another huge share price plunge. Capita, just like Carillion before it, has seen its shares cut by almost half, wiping £1 billion off its value. The outsourcing and computer systems company, which runs everything from London's congestion charge to tagging prisoners and collecting the BBC licence fee, stunned the markets by warning profits would be far below expectations and that it was looking to raise £700 million in an emergency cash call. Coming just 2 weeks after the collapse of Carillion, it's no wonder investors are rattled by Capita's surprise profit warning this morning. And there are worrying similarities between the two. Both are heavily indebted, both have big pension deficits, and both are closely intertwined with large public sector contracts, leaving the taxpayer potentially on the hook when things go wrong. So how do the two compare? Well, Capita has public sector contracts in excess of £1 billion, while Carillion's topped nearly £2 billion. Capita's profits are set to fall by nearly 50% this year to around £300 million. But Carillion lost over £1 billion in the first half of 2017 alone. Capita has a pension deficit of £380 million, while Carillion's black hole is around £1 billion. But the biggest problem for Capita is its debt, which at £1.2 billion is actually bigger than the £1 billion Carillion had when it collapsed.
What's clear is that we can't afford another Carillion. The government needs to put a pause on further outsourcing and privatisation until it carries out a proper risk assessment of these big contractors, and it's got to be ready to take contracts back in-house.
Where Carillion was heavily invested in risky construction projects with tight margins, Capita says its core business is more profitable consultancy and IT services. The problem is many of those contracts haven't been renewed and Capita's not won enough new ones. On top, they've loaded up with debt, making too many acquisitions, a staggering 74 in the last 6 years alone.
By way of services that include project management.
And like all outsourcing firms, they've been criticised for failing to deliver, with GP computer systems, for example, where the Doctors' Union today described the service as unacceptable.
The level of service they're providing to GPs up and down the country is an absolute shambles. And the last thing GPs in the country need is to have this kind of support system which doesn't really cater for what it's supposed to be delivering.
Capita declined to comment, but pointed to new contracts with Marks & Spencer and Transport for London signed in recent weeks. But nevertheless, its profit warning today has left nagging doubts that just like Carillion, the firm's troubles could escalate. The chief executive was at pains today to say there was no Carillion comparison. He told me, we're not facing some existential threat in the way that Carillion was. We've taken decisive action much earlier on. We're cutting our dividend, we've put in place a share sale, and we're selling non-core businesses. All of these things are proactive decisions, he said, to ensure that what happened to Carillion won't happen to us. Certainly Theresa May in China today seemed convinced. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister said she didn't believe that any of the government's strategic suppliers, including Capita, are in a comparable position to Carillion. Tens of thousands of the firm's employees are tonight hoping she's right.
Has outsourcing had its day? For decades now, it's been a mantra within government that virtually any activity is best put out to the market, running trains, prisons, construction projects, anything. Well, for a long time, some have thought that the private contractors coin it in at the expense of their workers and the taxpayers. But the news that a huge private contractor, Capita, has had to make a profit warning and has seen its share price plummet today, weeks after Carillion went bust, raises the question, does subcontracting work for anybody at all? Well, Capita is in a different place to Carillion. It's taking action that Carillion didn't to prevent itself becoming another sad business casualty. But its problems are just the latest to lead to a rethink about the activity that sits on the border of the public and private sectors. These are difficult times for believers in the private delivery of public services. It's not just the demise of Carillion. Other contracting companies face financial challenges. Train franchises are struggling too. Virgin Stagecoach pulling out of its East Coast contract. In Haringey, the Labour Council's been rocked by division over a public-private partnership for redeveloping social housing and other public assets. Is the game up for contracting?
These corporations, Mr. Speaker, need to be shown the door. We need our public services provided by public employees with a public service ethos and a strong public oversight.
It is commonly framed as binary. Private sector, all good or all bad. But in reality, when you think of all the things that go on inside an organisation, it's an argument about where you draw a line. the line between what you buy in from outside and what you keep in-house. It applies as much in the private sector as the public. Some areas are relatively clear-cut. Few organisations will want to maintain their own lifts. It's a specialist task. Lift servicing companies will likely be better at lift maintenance. Unless you're a lift company, lift maintenance is not your thing, so it's one to contract out.
Government should absolutely consider outsourcing in instances where the thing that it wants to buy is already being bought by lots of other people. So particularly if that's goods like, pencils or even catering, a service that lots of people are buying. Similarly, if it's really easy to measure the performance, then government is going to be able to have a good idea whether the provider that it is paying has delivered that service well. And similarly, is there going to be any reputation risk for government? In those instances, government should absolutely be looking to outsource.
Sometimes you need private expertise. When Ken Livingstone introduced a congestion charge to London, it was a formidable logistical task. Capita made it happen. And another advantage was that Capita could be penalised for any screw-ups, of which there were a few. Risk was transferred. But what about core activities? Do we expect government to outsource the role of government?
The big questions are about the delivery of complex services, so whether it's prisons or probation or adoption, government is the only organisation buying those services, and there's not a proper market. It's really difficult to measure performance, and if they go wrong, the government's likely to get blamed. So I think that is where the debate needs to be about whether outsourcing is right or not.
One challenge is that contracts are hard to draw up and monitor. You can argue about the definition of an egg in a catering contract if you want to. The second challenge is the companies which win contracts are often the ones who bid unrealistically, with awkward consequences.
Firstly, government is focused on price rather than quality or value for money, and as a result these firms have bid very low but have become quite overstretched and fragile, which means they're more likely to collapse. The second problem is that government has not put a huge amount of work into overseeing and managing these contracts well, which means that when these organisations do collapse, government is often taken unawares or doesn't have anything set up to pick up the pieces.
So, is it less a question about public or private being better and more a question of how effectively each manages the other? Well, I'm joined by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, Director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, and Julian Glover, who's Associate Editor of the Evening Standard, formerly David Cameron's government in advising there on transport. Good evening to you both. Let's start with where it goes wrong. Mariana, what would you highlight as where outsourcing goes wrong?
Well, I think it's interesting that we often use this word partnership. And I think where it goes wrong is we don't define what a good partnership is. I mean, if you talk to a biologist, they'll tell you that ecosystems can be parasitic or symbiotic. And I would argue that we actually currently have quite parasitic partnerships, and we can change that. We can actually change the contracts. But there's been this self-fulfilling prophecy also that the more we outsource the brains of government to the private sector, there's also been a lower capacity also to negotiate and to feel the confidence. For example, they should feel much more confident to have conditions on investment. You don't just outsource transport or health, you make it conditional on investments by the private sector in terms of actually increasing the quality. And you should also maintain some sort of direction. You should have a sense of what kind of transport system, what kind of prison care system.
So you want to keep the strategy in-house?
Yes, and you also should.
And you want the brains to be able to buy the services in-house, otherwise you've just subcontracted.
But there's also
everything.
this issue of profits. It's interesting that the recent debate has been that these companies are not profitable. But often when they're profitable, the question is there really a risk-reward relationship? Right. The first thing you learn in a finance class is that there should be.
Right.
But often
so they're either too
companies
profitable
are not,
or too unprofitable.
Well, they're not taking the risks. Right. They're often assuming that the public sector continues to actually take on, both in the beginning, the high-level risk, but also then bails them out when things go wrong. So often the reward, even when it's there, is not actually justified.
Julian Glover, you were in Department for Transport. I mean, you had all those famous problems with the East Coast, the West Coast franchises, trying to write a contract by which a private company was going to run something for the public. Did you think it worked or not?
I think the great challenge is writing the contract. A lot of the problems with these contracts in different areas the linking thing has been the government, the capability of government to know what it wants to be a good customer. If you're sure that for the next 30 years you want a single thing, you want a hospital run in one place without any changes, long period of time, it's not a bad idea to sign a lock-in contract for that period. The trouble is, a few years in, you decide to shift it. If you hand over a motorway to the private sector, the M25, currently maintained by the private sector, has done a very good job of fixing it up. But as soon as you decide to add a lane, change some lights, do anything, the costs pile in. The government is a poor client. It doesn't know what it wants. I think doing things often through private contractors is a good idea. Not all the time, not for everything, and you want a diversity of contractors.
Right, you
two
can't
or
just
three
have
big
two
companies
But why
bidding
is
for
the
everything.
government a poor client? Why?
The government is a poor client partly because of the nature of government. Government centralising decisions will always be difficult. When things were run purely through the centre, when it took 3 months to get a telephone through the post office, it wasn't ideal either. Direct labour organisations and local councils did not have a good record of building housing and maintaining housing well. So it is not the case that outsourcing is the problem. It's knowing what you want and being sure about it.
But the bidders get it wrong as well, don't they? They underbid. I mean, Virgin Stagecoach underbid for the East Coast Main Line. They couldn't make it work.
I would say they overbid. To be fair, the Virgin Stagecoach, who are running the railway well, I mean, don't forget the passenger satisfaction figures came out this week for the railways, 90% or so for the Virgin routes on East and West Coast. Passengers are happy with the service. The people who are losing out is actually the company, which is burning through its bond on East Coast. They had to pay a lot of money to win the contract.
But they still,
there is a question.
The problem is they race to get the contract. They win the contracts where they've been over-generous to and then they're strapped trying to make up the money on the little changes to the contract or just...
But I would fundamentally disagree with the point that government is inevitably, almost because of its DNA, a bad client or, you know, isn't going to be sort of efficient, which is what you're saying. That's precisely part of the problem, which I think is an ideological problem. There's many different periods in history in which government actually has functioned extremely well, has been both ambitious, bold, and efficient. In other periods, in its recent history, it hasn't been. But that's not just because things have changed like that. There's been a whole narrative, which basically comes from public choice theory, new public management, which has often convinced also civil servants themselves that government failures are even worse than market failures. And so be careful, don't even, you know, explore, don't take risks, don't invest. And when you stop investing in the brains, the capacity, the machinery of government, it's also going to be quite hard.
I spent 5 years working
things.
in the Department for Transport, working on all sorts of projects, trying to get things happening. I didn't find that culture. I did actually find a huge amount of government investment, money from the Treasury, not just borrowed money. In fact, PFIs were issued, these notorious PFIs, mostly happened before 2010. Things like the M25 one was signed just before the election in 2010 by the Labour Party. Lots of the rail contracts were let then as well. No, the enthusiasm was for the government to spend money, the government to do things. But you can't do
but it's not enough to
everything from the
spend.
centre.
You have to have the capacity. And capacity is a result of investment in
also the intellectual diversity. I mean, I'm a liberal. I believe in a diversity of people and places doing interesting things. I do worry about the idea. And I sat on the fourth floor of the Department for Transport. Very good people. I worry about them being in charge of everything and planning everything.
Let me just ask whether you'd each... Would you go the Corbyn route, Mariana, and say, look, what's wrong with just saying, let's just bring all of this in-house. We don't need private sector involvement in the NHS. We don't need private people redeveloping our council houses, for goodness sake. Let's just do it completely differently.
No. I mean, I think that what you should be doing is thinking about the problem at hand, which, by the way, is very different in health and transport in different areas, getting the different actors at the table, but the public sector should absolutely be there, I think, directing the show when we're talking about public services. And if the private sector does want a bit of the game, it has to, first of all, prove capable. It has to have capacity itself, because we're often talking about the public sector capacity, but actually what we've seen in the recent examples is an extreme inefficiency and lack of capacity in the private sector, but also what kind of risks they will take, what kind of investments. So getting the contracts and the deals right, which will actually produce public value, that's what Corbyn and Progressives should be fighting for. It's not about public
actually, I'm
versus
interested
private.
in Haringey. You know, that's been a hugely vicious political argument about Haringey and its redevelopment. Do you have your opinion on that one?
No.
Okay. But Julie, would you go far with, if you like, the more ideological right-wing approach that says government isn't very good, carry on subcontracting as far as we have been?
Actually, I go in both directions. I think there are certain things government should be more involved in, more controlling of, probably bits of urban transit. Although don't forget the overground, the railway in North and East London, which everybody loves, is a myriad of private contracts working together, but following what Mariana is saying, well-specified contracts with a clear plan. The trains, the track, everything's private, but it's directed. But no, in other areas, I think there should be more competition, less state direction. I don't think we should assume that all activity, the state has some guiding moral principle. And the danger of sliding into thinking that any private activity is somehow not as well-meaning for the public good as something
but
from government.
But there's a complete lack of transparency.
Adam Smith onwards, it has been pretty established that a series of individual people and groups doing things for their own interests can work together to enhance human well-being much better than central government.
But can I just say one thing? There's a lack of transparency. Just go to gov.uk/performance, and you have the performance targets and the efficiency gains of all the different public sector activities. Carillion, Capita, they have refused to provide that data. The first thing we should do is provide the data so we actually even have the sort of mapping of the landscape of just how inefficient things have become.
Point made. Julian, thank you. Very unideological debate about it.
Now, 377 job losses have been announced this morning at the construction and outsourcing firm Carillion that went into receivership last month. That firm's failure has been followed by profit warnings and share price falls from other companies in the sector. So is the outsourcing model that's been encouraged by successive governments broken? Last month, the construction giant Carillion collapsed after it was unable to secure financial support to continue trading. On Wednesday, more than £1 billion was wiped off the stock market value of Capita, which also handles government contracts. Other firms, Interserve, Mighty and Serco, have also seen their shares slide as investor concerns mount about the state of the wider outsourcing sector. Labour have called for an end to what they call the outsourcing racket. Under their plans, the public sector would be the default choice for providing government services. Jeremy Corbyn has also pledged a wage cap on bosses running the firms. Companies bidding for public sector work would have to stop executives earning more than 20 times the wage of their lowest paid worker. In the Commons yesterday, Labour's Rachel Reeves put down an urgent question on Capita. Oliver Dowden, Minister for the Cabinet Office, responded.
Now, the issues that led to the insolvency of Carillion will come out in due course, but our current assessment is that they primarily flowed from difficulties in construction contracts, including overseas. By contrast, Capita is primarily a services business, and 92% of Capita's revenues come from within the United Kingdom. Now, as members would expect, we regularly monitor the financial stability of all our strategic suppliers, including Capita, and as I've said, we do not believe that any of them are in a comparable position to Carillion.
Dowden. And joining us now from Derby is the Labour MP Chris Williamson, and we're joined here in the studio by the former Conservative Minister Francis Maude. Welcome to both of you. Chris Williamson, first of all, Oliver Dowden said that the government doesn't believe Capita is in any way in a comparable position to Carillion. They're not the same, are they?
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And clearly there is a concern because Capita has issued a profit warning and they're in some difficulties, it seems to me. Now, this is the same pattern that was followed by Carillion. I frankly think that the outsourcing model is broken. It's one that's been used for the last 4 decades, and I think we need to move away from it to a system which is more trustworthy and better value for money.
And that means bringing everything into the public sector, then, into your mind?
Well, that should be the default position. That's the Labour Party's position, as you said in the opening package there. But it is, I think, a more cost-effective way of delivering public services. It's certainly more accountable and transparent. I mean, the other thing about these outsourcing companies is they are exempt from the Freedom of Information Act provisions. So, you know, these people are, it seems to me, getting away potentially with murder, really, and we need to call a halt to it and get better value for money for the taxpayer and better oversight, democratic oversight of these activities. I mean, we can't allow these companies to continue going bust and ripping off the public purse.
Francis Maude, should alarm bells be ringing? Are you worried now about the state of Capita, bearing in mind what happened to Carillion? Capita has even more public sector contracts than Carillion. Is the system broken?
No, the system isn't broken, but it has to be managed. It has to be managed in a very active and effective way. I mean, I don't know what's going on in Capita. They've been very open as a public company. They're obliged to be open about what's going on. They've issued a profit warning, and all of that's there on the face of it. But you know, outsourcing is not a panacea for every ill. I mean, Chris is a sort of hardline ideologue who thinks private sector bad, public sector automatically good. I'm not someone who thinks the reverse. I think it's horses for courses. But if you do outsource, you need to do it well.
Right, and it wasn't done well under Carillion, was it? Because in the end, the government did have the wool literally pulled over its eyes.
Well, one of the things I discovered when I had responsibility for this area in 2010 was that the way procurement was being done, public procurement was being done, almost deliberately froze out smaller, newer, more dynamic and innovative suppliers. And we changed that. I mean, there were rules like you've got to show 3 years audited accounts, turnover thresholds, things that made it almost impossible for smaller businesses to bid for and win government business. And so the big ones, the giants, had far too much of it their own way. And actually too many of them became good. Their principal competency was not doing the work, it was winning the business.
Right.
And that's not a healthy position to be in. So we did reform that. But one of the things we put in place was senior private sector Crown representatives, we called them, who had a part-time role, but whose job it was to be the kind of gatekeeper with the big strategic suppliers to government.
All right,
to try and ensure this doesn't happen.
Let me come back to Chris Williamson.
All of those are in place still.
Let me come back to Chris Williamson on the question of ideology. Is it, in your mind, Chris Williamson, always a case that public is good and private bad, that all outsourcing should be stopped because you are ideologically so committed to the public sector, whether or not one is better than the other?
Well, I'm afraid it's a neoliberal ideology that's been holding sway over the country for, well, really since 1979. And, you know, if you actually talk to most people out in the country, they, I think, agree with us. Most people don't like the fact that the private sector is essentially ripping off the public purse. I mean, let's remember that the first priority for these companies is to make a profit. And they're making billions and billions of pounds in profit. Surely, wouldn't it be better to have these things delivered in-house, and then the dividends which are dished out to the shareholders would not be necessary, and that money could then be reinvested and improving the services that, you know, we all win.
Well, let me put that to Francis Maud. Well, let me put that to Francis Maud. I mean, if it's going to, in the end, the companies are going to go bust because of the system you've just described, but they've made billions in the process.
It must be obvious to the meanest intelligence that Carillion and Capita aren't making billions.
But they were, and shareholders at Carillion. Yeah, but Francis Maud, shareholders did pay themselves an awful lot of money, even when the finances were looking precarious. I mean, that's what's been revealed.
But they're not been making billions and billions of profits. Look, this has to be done right.
Come on,
you have to procure it in the right way, you have to manage the contracts in the right way, and you have to open it up to smaller companies. And that's the way to do it. But this idea that somehow the public sector, because it doesn't make a profit, is always better. There is, in the public sector, there's too much aversion to innovation. There is a bias to inertia rather than a bias to innovation.
Right.
You do not get progress and value for money without the innovation.
Chris Williamson, what do you say?
Well, Francis is just burying his head in the sand and is a stranger to reality, it seems to me. Of course, the public sector is perfectly capable of innovation, but what he's ignoring is the fact that billions of pounds, and the public record shows this, have been paid out in dividends to shareholders. That is a fact. And furthermore, the fat cat executives at the top of these organisations are paying themselves colossal sums. And we hear the Conservatives often railing about the level of remuneration for local authority chief executives. They paled into insignificance against the multi-million-pound salary packages that these executives in these private outsourcing companies are receiving. I mean, the chief exec of Capita, for example, the outgoing chief exec, I think his remuneration package was just under £3 million. These are colossal figures, and it's being subsidised by the public purse. And very often we're getting poor quality.
You've made your point very clear, but what evidence have you got that the public sector would run all of these services and build all of the constructions that have been undertaken by private companies in the meantime if there hadn't been outsourcing?
Well, of course. I mean, if the model that existed prior to this outsourcing agenda was precisely that, and you know, we seem to manage perfectly well, if not better. And indeed, the economic performance of the country. I can hear Francis scoffing, but listen, the economic performance of the country was at least as good, if not better,
we're not talking about
than
the
at any
economic
time.
No, we're just talking about whether or not these
1979.
buildings would have been made if there hadn't been outsourcing. You were laughing there. What are you...
It was this idea that somehow everything was fine before there was outsourcing is complete nonsense. Governments have struggled with this, and as the size of the state has grown and the scope of state activity has grown, it's absolutely essential to find different ways of doing things. Otherwise, you get no progress, no innovation.
But actually, Francis, at the beginning of the coalition government, there was a huge amount of noise around smaller companies.
Yeah.
The Social Values Act was passed,
Absolutely.
where contracts had to be given to people who would bring social value to the community. It didn't make any difference.
It did. It made quite a lot of difference.
It didn't make any difference. And if you look at something like the work programme, just as a for instance, all the contracts were taken off social value companies.
Right. Well, what are the facts then? What's the evidence for it?
I'll give you one example. That when I took over in 2010. 87% of the government spend on IT was with 7 multinational suppliers. We actually insourced some of that. The previous Labour government had done mass outsourcing,
okay, that's
so there
good.
was too little capability inside the government. But we also opened up procurement to smaller social enterprises, small developers, start-ups. So actually, by the end of by 2015, you look at the map of suppliers to the government, and there were dots literally all over
Okay, but can I give you a counter-example?
Just briefly, and then I must bring Harry.
That's how you can open it up.
I want to give you 2 counter-examples. One of them is the work programme, the other one is the prison service.
And that wasn't opened up enough.
And that was... No, they weren't just not opened up. They were divvied out to like 7 or 8 major companies.
It should have been opened up more.
Well, this has had a massive impact.
The problem that the government have is people like Chris and the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn and, dare I say it, Zoe, are going to be making these arguments regardless of whether it's going well and of whether this is working or not.
At the moment, it doesn't look as if it's going well, does it?
But the easiest way to talk down a public company is to go on television and
seriously, we should just say they're doing fine for their share price.
Of course not. But the problem is that Chris, for example, was making these arguments even in the good times. It's an ideological thing for them. But the problem is the government need to start making elegant defences of this, like Francis has, because voters are listening to people like Chris.
It's not an elegant defence to say leave them alone in case it damages.
Right, all right.
I'm saying
no, that's what he said.
That's what I said. Francis made much better.
Don't talk. If you talk over each other, nobody can hear. So on that, I'm going to move on slightly, Francis, to talk about Theresa May. Can she stay on as leader with all of this going on?
Well, she can stay on, yes, clearly. Until there's a move in the parliamentary party with sufficient people calling for a vote of confidence, she'll stay on, yeah.
Right, how close is that?
I have absolutely no idea. You'd have to ask Graham Brady, and he certainly won't tell you.
Right, no, he won't, and we've all asked. But at the moment, viewing it from the outside, as you are now on her leadership, does she need to be bolder about what she says on Brexit?
Well, actually, I think she's getting a bit of a bad rap on this Brexit thing. This idea that the government hasn't said what it wants, it seems to me nonsense. The government has said what it wants. It wants the maximum frictionless and tariff-free trading goods. It wants maximum access to the single market, particularly for financial services.
So why all the squabbling then?
And it doesn't want to have to pay for it, and it doesn't want to have to accept free movement. It does want to have its cake perfectly reasonably and eat it.
So why all the squabbling in the party?
Well, because this is... Look, what's going on between the UK and the EU is a very public negotiation with a lot of megaphone diplomacy. What's going on in the Conservative Party, completely understandably, is a bit of the same thing. People staking out positions in order to try and influence where this quite complicated negotiation ends up.
Has she got a grip of the party in the negotiations?
I shouldn't think anyone could have a grip of the party at the moment, because this is a very intense time. And so whoever was leading the party at the moment would have a really difficult time. And I don't think it's necessarily a problem. What the government will have to do over this next period is engage very seriously with the EU negotiators and work out what are the gives, what's the settling point, and it won't be like it's a linear spectrum and where between hard Brexit and soft Brexit we end up. There are lots of different strands.
All right.
Some of them, and they'll be met, and the settling point will be.
Well, then, in that, should a government minister be standing at the dispatch box and accusing the civil service of obstructing Brexit?
Well, I've no idea what was going on there. I barely noticed that this was happening.
But the broad question, should a government minister be criticising the civil service in the way that Steve Baker did at the dispatch box? Any government minister?
I frequently got called out for criticising the civil service because it is ridiculous have this idea that ministers can never be critical of the civil service. Of course they can. I don't know what was going on there. I think the point that Bill Cash was making, that there is in much of the political and governmental establishment a deep-seated comfort with us being in the EU and discomfort with us leaving it, and that in the subconscious and the unconscious possibly makes a difference to how they...
Finally, on her leadership, do you think Theresa May would be advised to set a departure date now and say when she was going to go?
That'll be a totally matter for her.
Of course it's a matter for her, but do you think it would be wise?
I think you could argue it both ways, and it would probably be an inconclusive argument.
Oh. And on that, Francis Maud, thank you. Yes. Chris Williamson is staying with us. Now,